set auto-destruct sequence.
It's the time allotted that concerns me.
Recognize Picard, Jean-Luc, Captain. Recognize Riker, William T., Commander.
Maximum warp!
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I'm UrzaMaster, joining me as always, Lord Uther, and from the great beyond, we've got Fert Derby, where no man has gone before, into the black abyss of space and time, but still with us via audio. Welcome, gentlemen, welcome. Today, this time, we are recording our 100th Warp Core Podcast.
Yay! Golf clap.
We're recording this live on Father's Day 2025. The episode will release in a few days here, but happy Father's Day, gentlemen, fur babies and babies alike. I know we've all had a time today celebrating, and now it's time to celebrate another father figure. Of course, I'm talking Jean-Luc Picard, if Q will. And we are talking The Big Goodbye on episode 100 of the Warp Core Podcast here. The Big Goodbye is probably what I would call the first season's most consequential episode in terms of setting up future character development. But I don't want to take anything away from Fert Derby here. Fert, tell us about The Big Goodbye and all of the fun that went into this episode.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. Again, happy Father's Day to you both and to all of our loyal Warp Core viewers. Welcome back as we continue our journey of Season 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation and our trip through the Bermanverse. Just stick around with us for the next 4+ years and we'll get you through every single episode of arguably one of Star Trek's most promising and exciting eras. This is the first episode that aired in 1988, January 11th, which means, if you're following us along back then in real time, Lord Uther and I have both turned 15 years old. So there we are. How consequential. We've been 15 years old for approximately 2.5 weeks for some and approximately 11 days for others. So that's exciting. We're still freshmen in high school. And we're still learning, taking baby steps on that journey we call life. And so here we are, already at The Big Goodbye, directed by Joseph L. Scanlon, and our writer is Tracy Torme. And a brief note on Tracy Torme, we spoke of him at length on the prior episode, Haven. This is our second Torme in a row. And he was, again, the son of Mel. Mel, of course, wrote the ubiquitous holiday classic, The Christmas Song, and Tracy never had to work a day in his life from just based on the royalties of that song and how many times it's been covered. He was a USC Loyola Marymount student, worked on Saturday Night Live, worked on The Next Generation for its first 2 seasons, and then, of course, contributed mightily, created, show-ran, wrote one of UrzaMaster's favorite Fox mid-90s science fiction shows, not named The X-Files, Sliders. And then, of course, he wrote the movie that scared UrzaMaster back in the early 90s, the UFO abduction thriller Fire in the Sky from 1993, which also featured a big screen James Garner. So that was more the merrier there. So this was Tracy's second episode back-to-back with Haven, which when Counselor Troy caught in a love triangle. You'll remember that one. Kind of a lighter toned one. This one has film noir, Chinatown, Humphrey Bogart, Mike Hammer, all of those great two-fisted detectives, Dashiell Hammett, leans heavily into those settings and tropes. And so it's a little bit tonally different than Haven for Tracy, showing some range. Joseph L. Scanlon, I mentioned, was the director. He was the director of an NBC soap opera. It was spun off from Another World. Your parents may remember these, Warp Core viewers. It aired from 1970 to 1976, and it was called Somerset. Now, When I say that Joseph L. Scanlon was the primary director of a soap opera, out of 1,710 episodes that aired on NBC, he directed 1,665 of them. So yes, he was pretty much there in and out each day for 6 years directing this soap opera on NBC. And he also worked in primetime soaps. He did some Knots Landing. He did some Falcon Crest. Google those CBS evening dramas. And he did 4 episodes of The Next Generation, this being the first. This episode earned an Emmy Award for Outstanding Costumes, naturally set in the gumshoe periods of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And it also earned a prestigious Peabody Award in 1987. Now, Emmys, they come in every year, and the Peabodys are usually assigned where you stand out culturally. Film, television, literature, etc., etc. When you've made a mark on the culture, that's usually, it's a prestige prize. And this episode in particular was high-ranging, high-flying, and it did win that. Now, returning champion director Rob Bowman, who will do 13 episodes of Next Gen before all is said and done. He was originally set to direct this, but because of production delays, they switched him over to the next Warp Core we'll be talking about, Datalore, and that's how Joseph Scanlon got behind the camera. This was the first episode in the series to focus exclusively on the holodeck. As UrzaMaster suggested, not only did we get a lot of character development in here, but this was also a foundational episode for the types of stories that Star Trek in the Bermanverse liked to tell. Being able to go to another timeline, another world, and etc. Being able to do all sorts of comedy and dance and nightclubs and jungle settings and wherever their imaginations could take them. The holodeck opened up a world of possibilities unavailable in the original series because of budget restraints and so on and so forth. So this was where it all kind of starts, and all of your favorite holodeck characters and episodes sprung forth from the big goodbye. A couple of notable cameos, if you're film and TV fans. Lawrence Tierney, of course. Many of us remember him from Quentin Tarantino's directorial debut, Reservoir Dogs in 1992. Well, here he is 4 years earlier as Cyrus Redblock, the heavy, the big bad, if you will, with his trademark gravelly voice and squint. So nice to see Lawrence here. And Dick Miller, who is the newspaper vendor. You've seen him in tons of things. You've seen him in The Terminator. He was selling, trying to sell phase plasma rifles to the T-800. You saw him in Gremlins. He's the one who said Gremlins were tearing apart his airplane wing, and then the snowplow comes and gets him. He's been in just hundreds. If you IMDb Dick Miller, he's just one of those character-y guys. That's how he made his living, and it was great to see him in here. Gene Roddenberry was credited with coming up with the idea of having an ongoing detective novel in the show. He doesn't have a writing credit on here, but that was apparently one of those things they talked about in the writer's room. This is the first appearance of Jean-Luc Picard as Dixon Hill. He'll show up in 2 more episodes during the series run, and of course make a big screen appearance in Star Trek First Contact. And both Joseph Scanlon and Tracy Torme, they wanted to film this in black and white to fit the mood, the classic Maltese Falcon, Big Sleep kind of vibe. But this was 1987, this was syndicated television, and Rick Berman said no. So we got it in the color. Still won its Emmy for costume, still won the Peabody, but they wanted to really go all out and do it in a black and white, and I guess either budgetary reasons or what have you, that was vetoed from the production crew. So gentlemen, that being said, you've got our characters attempting to portray, private eyes and lawyers and so forth, and then you've got the back and forth, the tough talking dialogue. You've got a running gag that Data's from South America. which we obviously was very amusing. I've written down here a quote, "I lost a bet," which refers, of course, to why Picard is in his Starfleet digs instead of a overcoat and top hat, fedora. And we even have some existential themes. And again, remember, we've seen this now dozens of times in later incarnations of Trek, as well as other films and TV, Westworld and Blade Runner and everything. But an existential crisis for holograms. If you turn me off or you stop the program, am I still here? Do I still exist? Is any of this real? And again, for science fiction, that's always been a provocative question. You don't even need to answer it so much as ponder it. And so I ask you, gentlemen, what did you ponder on this foundational episode, our first in January of '88, The Big Goodbye?
This was a great episode. I loved the original series episodes where they went back in time, or there was some 20th century tie-in, and we actually talked about them right here on the Warp Core podcast already. And part of the reason I like those is because of episodes like this. The Dixon Hill episodes I thought were great. Moriarty we'll see later on in the series. I love the holodeck episodes of this Voyager and Deep Space Nine. I loved all of them. They're always good. It's always kind of the same setup. You know, there's some sort of a power surge, or a circuit burns out, or somebody disables the safeties, or something of the like. But it's always an entertaining episode. It's so bizarre. And they explore all the things I think we would all ask of, what would you do with this technology? I mean, certainly there are plenty of people who love, you know, this kind of private eye stories, this era, and definitely of the time. I think this was kind of a romanticized period for a lot of people. So it was just an excellent topical choice by the writers. And I loved how you finally start to get this intense romantic attraction between Beverly Crusher and Jean-Luc Picard, and you kind of see that play out, like they're just trying to get a private moment, but somebody keeps interrupting, and it's so comical. And I don't know that, like, you don't quite get that in the rest of the series. They really harp on this in season 1 quite a bit, that there's some sort of unspoken romance there, and it feels like typical Star Trek, I think. And then, of course, as they flesh it out and it gets depth with later seasons, as they explain some of the more detailed background of why they aren't just like in a relationship, it really does make that way more interesting than any of the Kirk romances that we saw in the original series, or even the Kirk romances we see in the movies. So really setting Picard apart from Kirk in this episode is big. And you put Riker on this stage where he has to be sort of the inverse of his own character. He's got to kind of be that captain that's able to step up and take over this important role, and just is immediately getting shut down. Like he's striking out. Meanwhile, you know, this romantic adventure is happening for Picard, although things go clearly sideways. But I thought it was just kind of an interesting challenge to some of the typical archetypes we see. And of course, I love the fact it's totally foundational for TNG. This is one of those episodes that, you know, as we get to the latter part of season 1, the show really starts to catch its stride in certain areas, and this is probably the first one where it really feels like a later Trek episode.
Yes. So with that, thanks everybody for joining us. No, I'm going to take this in a different direction, because I was talking to my brother-in-law this weekend about Will Wheaton and just Wesley Crusher in general. And so one of you guys hopefully can confirm this for me, or maybe you've heard this rumor, that he left the series because he wasn't in a role that he felt was good for him or good for the series, somewhere along that line. And they talked about making him a lieutenant commander, or making him a lieutenant at some point. Like, they were telling Will Wheaton they were going to do this, and he still was like, I'm out of here. I'm not going to do this anymore. Do we know the story behind why he steps away? Because it seems like he goes away from it, and it also kind of seemed like, at least with I'm guessing Stand By Me was before this,
Yes,
right?
about a year.
Okay. So he kind of almost seems like a little bit of an up and coming performer, like a lot of those kids kind of were. And then he goes to Star Trek, and then it's almost like he's not getting what he wants, and then he steps away, or they write him out. I don't know what the story is there. So who can clarify that? And I'm gonna listen.
Fert may have more insight, but I'm not a big student of Will Wheaton, but I do know during this era he was going through some abuse, I think, as a child actor, and I've always wondered if that had something to do with why he left the show. I don't think it was necessarily happening on Star Trek as much, maybe, as it was with like Stand By Me and some of the movies he was doing. But I know this was kind of that era where he I think he had all that trouble with his parents, like, and some other things going on in his life. So I've always thought it probably had more to do with that, more so than feeling like his character didn't have a real good place on the show. I will say the way that they write him off, it does justice, because this early part of the series, like, you can see the things they're doing with Picard and Beverly Crusher and Data, they're really digging into the backstory and shaping up these characters. It really does feel out of place to kind of have a kid in the command structure. Not in a bad way necessarily, like, hindsight's 2020. Maybe at the time it felt a little more contrived or a money grab. I know in a couple episodes we'll be talking a more Wesley forward episode, but I do think that that's something that they may have missed the mark a little bit on with episodes like this, where I think you have some opportunity to elevate Wesley as a character. But that being said, it did feel a little weird to have, like, the child prodigy, so to speak. I always felt like the character itself was just a little out of place. Not a lot, but just enough.
Well, because to your point, and I'll let Fert jump in because I'm sure he has the information, but it seemed like everyone, maybe except for Worf, they were figuring out the paths for those characters, and I felt like Wesley was a version of Data where he was like the everyman, right? He can pilot the ship, he knows about whatever space-time continuums. He can't. Now he's the one that is scanning through the holodeck, trying to find them. Not one of your engineers, or not Geordi. It's the kid scrolling through there because Deanna Troy's like, his mom is in there too. You're going to turn this over to a 16-year-old to try and find the captain and the chief medical officer? Like that's what we're doing?
Weird. Yeah.
It is weird, and it feels out of place. And I do agree, as they go along, it almost feels like they start turning him into a just regular old Starfleet personnel type of person, except he still might be able to, create wormholes because he might be this type of almost like a chosen one. That's for a different podcast. But anyway, it just like they still were having a hard time figuring it out.
I think
help.
I think to address your point, I'd have to look at it more as a creative movement rather than what was going on necessarily with Will Wheaton as the actor and performer. I think, remember the Trek original series, mid to late 60s. And it intended to be a family show. Families could tune in and watch and all that. But the show was generally this grown-up crew fighting Klingons and godlike beings and the like. And then in the interim, we had an animated series from Filmation, and then, conventions and so forth. And then Star Wars pops in 77, and then everybody wants droids and Wookiees and lightsabers and everything. And then Star Trek on the big screen still stays with its sort of grown-up approach. Now Spock and Kirk and Scotty and McCoy and Uhura, they're all older, particularly they can't quit talking about it in Star Trek 2, and so forth. And I think when we finally get to the runway for Next Generation, whether it's Gene, whether it's somebody close to Gene, someone else in the writer's room, somebody says, hey, you know what? We want to make sure kids are watching this. You know, kids love science fiction. They love Spielberg and Goonies. And like, let's, you know, who's a hot actor out there? Oh, it's Will Wheaton. So I think they come up creatively with this notion that we'll have a young character. And we see this again in Sequest with Roy Scheider. They threw in like, you know, for no inexplicable reason, we had a 16-year-old on the bridge, and you know, it's basically a Wesley Crusher, diet Wesley Crusher, you know, Buck Rogers kept bringing back Gary Coleman and Tweaky, and so there was this thing, Boxy and his Daggett Muffet on Battlestar Galactica in '78. There was this attempt to try to capture the youth vote, and I think that's what Wesley starts off as. And I think part of it is that some of these people who would then write for the show kind of resented, I got to write for the kid. You know, like I want to write for, you know, Crusher and Picard. I want to write Data. He's cool. I want to write, you know, like, and and that's not something that Will Wheaton can control. When the showrunners and the producers and so forth are saying, I want more focus on, you know, Troy and Riker, and, you know, the kid can come in and fix the equation and solve it in 5 minutes. There could have been some of that too. Like I said, it was kind of a complicated mix. I think they came up with this notion that we want to have a younger character on there to represent that voice, so that people, you know, teenagers, and oh, he was so dreamy in Stand By Me, that teenagers can latch on to him. And then they never really did the character enough justice. Although, coming from someone like me, who had not seen all of these original first season episodes, I thought they were doing a heck of a job, you know, crafting this boy Mozart. You know, he's got real possibilities, you know, keep an eye on this one. I, personally, just sitting on the sidelines, I thought that they were really giving us a pretty good setup for something that happened down the road. And like I say, it was probably a confluence of his things happening offset versus like decisions being made on set. And as a performer, as an actor, you're always telling yourself, you know, can I be doing more? Can I, you know, I'm barely in this episode, you know, I come in, I say, yes, Captain, you know, and then I get up and leave the bridge. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing there too. You know, Michael Dorn is being underutilized early, as we've discussed and will discuss. And then when you see the kind of character development they give him in both later seasons of this show and Deep Space Nine, you say, wow, you know, where was all this in, you know, January of '88? So, yeah, I think I like having him around. I don't find him particularly galling, annoying. I know that we've said that about a certain security chief personnel. And don't worry, her day is coming. But yeah, I mean, it was just one of those things. It was 1988. Things were different. I think it would be handled much more professionally and different now in this era. I can almost guarantee it.
One last question, because this is a great episode. All of our great Trek fans out there know that. Because they were going to do a Starfleet Academy series at some point. I know that discussion, I think, was even coming up back then, right?
Yes.
Was he going to be a part of that? Along with, because I thought wasn't there an episode where there was all those cadets who,
him and
you know what I'm talking about?
And then there was another one with like Bajoran cadet and the Alpha team that flew the shuttle too close to something or other and caused an accident.
Yeah, so I know there are a couple of those types of episodes. And I thought there was one where they were playing poker, like the senior officers were. Was that was that episode actually called Lower Decks?
Yep, that was the Lower Decks.
Which is okay. So there we go. Which is obviously what the other TV series gets its name from. But were they ever going to spin them off into their own series, or was that something they weren't even sure about?
As long as there's been a modern Star Trek, and by modern I mean from the motion picture on, there have been rumblings, rumors, and threats to make a Starfleet Academy show, and at every juncture it has fallen through because Gene wanted to do it for Star Trek V, and that was vetoed. and then he wanted to do it on television, and that was like it was just one of those evergreen ideas. And so, lo and behold, long-suffering Star Trek fans, here we are now in the year of our Lord 2025, and within, I think, either the next calendar year or pretty darn close, we will finally get on Paramount Plus a Starfleet Academy television series with Holly Hunter as like the university president and so on, and a whole new cast. Some of them spun off from Star Trek Discovery and guest spots and all the like. So it's finally happening. It's finally been shot. I want to say Paul Giamatti is the big bad, which would also be very interesting.
Yes, he is.
So, I mean, that will definitely, if you're a fan of Strange New Worlds and Discovery and Picard and so forth, this will definitely, whet your appetite. But yes, that thing has been a 40-year-old gold nugget waiting to be unearthed, and we will finally get its chance. And my fingers are crossed; it'll be magnificent. And that should be, I don't know if it's out later this year because it's been a real crowded release schedule and Paramount's on tenterhooks. It might be next year, but it's coming in the not too distant future.
That's exciting. Well, I think The Big Goodbye sets the Star Trek universe up for big things. That's not a cheesy line I just came up with. I'm just stupid. But no, I love this episode, but it is time to give it the Warp Core ratings. Bear in mind, we're very early in TNG here, so this is foundational. But let's not get too biased with what we've seen thus far. Let's kick it off with Lord Uther. What Warp Core rating do you have for this episode?
I'm gonna go 6 out of 7. Excellent point that it is, it's foundational. We're going to see this again. It's an important part of Trek. You're right. It comes up again in one of my favorite movies, which is First Contact. I mean, so we're going to see a lot of those great things come out of this. That spark of which you brought up, the Picard, Dr. Crusher relationship possibly happening. Which, by the way, awkward, kind of weird. This supposedly Picard sends the husband on a mission where he dies, and all of a sudden they're falling in love. Whole nother episode, I'm sure we could talk about. Just that by itself. So 6 out of 7 for me. Urza?
I'll defer to Fert Derby here. What did you think of this episode?
Well, the twin Tormes I've seen, I'm in the same boat. Haven got a 6, and Data. The Big Goodbye is getting a 6 for me here. Just strong stuff. I wrote down in my notes, Picard smokes, ? Data's a speed reader. There's lipstick on a captain. You could cut the tension with a knife. And then I had Picard speaks insect ? So I mean, again, deciphering my notes leads me to believe, instead of trailing off, why, God, why? These are fun. It was a fun episode. Very, very happy that we got Dixon Hill. I wish we could have had more of him, but we'll get him a couple more times, and then we'll get him on the big screen in First Contact.
And I will round it out with the Devil's Trio here. I'm also giving it a 6 out of 7 Warp Cores. Clean sweep, 6 out of 7 today, and for all the reasons stated, I think this is just a great foundational episode. It's far from perfect. There are some little silly nuances to it, and it is early, but it definitely, it's an unforgettable episode. This is definitely one I would point to and say, look, if you wanted to get to know TNG, you got to watch The Big Goodbye, especially before certain other episodes later in the series. Definitely before First Contact, otherwise you're going to wonder, why did they just throw a random holodeck sequence into First Contact? So yeah, this is a great one. More great episodes to come from the next generation. But stick with us, Pending Rebrand fans. This is episode 100. Thank you for being with us thus far. We are continuing on that mission to bring you all of Star Trek and everything that comes from Star Trek moving forward as we make it so.